This year marks the 75th anniversary of the 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act, a groundbreaking piece of legislation that recognised the importance of everyone being able to access and enjoy naturally beautiful places. Welcome to the Landscape Podcast. I'm Lindsay Chapman and I'm celebrating this important milestone with two special episodes of the pod. The first one is already available, so if you haven't listened yet, where have you been? There's loads in there about the history of the Act and the role Natural England has played in delivering its aims, including Chief Executive Marian telling me why the connection between people and nature is so important. Marian's back on this pod, but first I want to look forward and think about what the Act could mean for all of us over the next 75 years. To do that, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Stuart Pasley, who is Principal Officer Strategy for Resilient Landscapes and Seas, which is a cracking title at Natural England. Hi, Stuart.
Hello.
Hello. And Julian Gray, who is Chair of National Trails UK. And Julian, you also sit on Natural England's Landscape Advisory Panel, don't you?
I do. Hello, and thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you both. Stuart, how long have you worked for Natural England?
Since Natural England was created, which was 2006.
And have you seen attitudes shift when it comes to landscape and changing landscape?
I think it has. I think we tended, certainly in the past, we tended to think of landscape as being something relatively static, something to be conserved. We now put a lot more emphasis on to the way landscapes change and the need to enhance and change landscapes for the future.
I'm so pleased that you said enhancement, because that's really what I want to focus on with both of you, is sort of looking to the future. Obviously, the Act is 75 years old, but let's try, if we can, to think forward 75 years, which, by the way, takes us to 2099. Do you think that audiences or the public in 75 years will want to use the land in the same way that people in 1949 did, because we do have threads that run through, or do you see that sort of completely flipping on its head? What do you think, Julian?
I mean, I think there's a real issue about connection to nature, and going back probably about 40 years ago, there was a kind of shift where people started to see kind of retail as a kind of a leisure activity rather than getting out into the countryside. Technology has really ramped that up. And now there's a lot more engagement online than there is in the real world. So to me, kind of if I'm looking at, say, a national trail and people accessing a national trail, I want people to put their phones away and walk on it. Yet I can also see people using technology to be able to aid them in their journey in terms of planning, using VR, using augmented reality and all kinds of tools. And those are actually quite exciting. So I don't want to judge future people in how they engage with technology and the landscape, but it's going to be one of the opportunities, but also one of the challenges.
Let's challenge some of these views then, because I know that both of you, you've got thoughts and you've got opinions. If you had sort of the perfect world, and if someone came to you and said, right, you can legislate again around this, what would you like to bring to the nation for the next 75 years? What would you put into an act that's being made now?
I think one of the unintended consequences of the 49 Act was a separation in many ways between what was termed natural beauty, so thinking about the character of places and the way people enjoyed places, connected with places, and the more scientifically based nature conservation side of things like sites of special scientific interest. I would love to see a system emerge that brings those two halves back together again, and we think about the environment in a more rounded way, thinking about the heritage, the geology, the landscape aspects, the wildlife, nature conservation aspects.
Okay, and I think picking up from that, I would look at it from the people side of things. So maybe a more democratic way that we engage with our designation of protected landscapes, and also how we manage those for people and improve equity of access. Because it feels today that those issues are even worse than they were 75 years ago.
I think that's something that I'm really fascinated with myself, because I always, in the work that I do, I always talk about people, because people are at the heart of what we do, and if we want to make change, it has to come through generating that relationship. And there is a lot of talk about the disconnect between people and the natural world, and sort of looking maybe not 75 years ahead, but the next few years. Where do you think those differences can really be made? And is that underpinned by an act that was made 75 years ago, do you think?
I'd like to see a lot more attention on the importance of urban areas where the vast majority of people live and work and play and learn. So things like creating much greener urban landscapes, I think, should be a much higher priority. That's something that Natural England is just beginning to move into, but there's a lot further we could go, and it's the sort of thing which needs action, attention from right across government. It's not something Natural England could do by itself.
And I think the other element to that, Stuart, I think, is looking at how you get from urban areas to kind of more wild areas. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm using inverted commas here, not very good for podcasts. But that whole concept of being able to get out of an urban area, even if it is greened in itself, into those wider spaces is really important. So the idea of corridors, but corridors not just for nature recovery, but for access recovery as well, for getting people out and into that kind of that green space.
I wonder whether it's also the notion of letting people know that these areas are for them as well, because there can be a bit of a barrier there, perhaps if you've come from an urban background, that you don't feel these spaces are for you, and how we link that idea that actually they are, and you can go and use them.
Really important that people feel welcome in wherever they're going and whatever sort of space they're using. So things like National Trails do a lot of work on that kind of thing. There's always more that can be done. Trying to get away from that image that you have to have all the expensive kit to be able to go and use these sorts of places. It should be available for anybody.
Which we've talked about across the podcast, you know, in terms of using Shaun the Sheep and the countryside code, which might be something that feels 75 years old, but actually reframing it for a modern audience is really important. Julian, your eyes, though, lit up when you talked about trails. Just tell me, you know, your love is clearly in that area, and what you would want to pass on, and what the Act did for trails.
Yeah, I mean, my love is for trails because they get people on journeys, and they also help transform people along those journeys and get people from, say, urban areas to other urban areas, but through green space. And getting near to green space and blue space is really, really important.
When we talk about people, I think that change is a really interesting concept, because I am a change tortoise. Like, I am not good at change, and it takes me a long time to get into something, but then once I get used to it, you know, I tend to sort of begin to flourish. And I just wonder, you know, could there be some fight back in terms of saying, well, we don't want our beautiful landscapes to change, but then we have to adapt to what's coming?
Yes, indeed. You'll always get a whole range of different views about any particular place in any particular landscape. But change is constant. The landscapes we have around us today in 2024 have evolved over thousands and thousands of years. They're evolving now, and they'll change in the future. And one of the key things that we need to be doing now is thinking about what landscapes do we need for the future? How do we decide what those landscapes should be like? What are all the factors that need to be fitted into those landscapes? What are the pressures on those landscapes? And then start to positively plan for the landscapes that we're going to need in the future.
What do you think about change, Julian?
It's inevitable, for starters, and I think there's just a piece here about taking a leadership role as well. I think Natural England and those bodies looking after the national parks, national landscapes and national trails need to really start having a conversation with people about what those landscapes are and how they will change over time. And so as we change landscapes, we should be saying, this is what things can look like and these are the opportunities, and get people to actually be part of that conversation.
I think opportunity is a brilliant word. Thank you very much. What are the opportunities here as we look forward to sort of make something that is sustainable for the future, but also something that's just enjoyable, you know?
I think there's some real opportunities in terms of getting people more involved in their local landscapes. We've just been doing some really interesting work that starts to open up issues around things like environmental and social justice, just transition in terms of the forces that will be happening through climate change, thinking about things like regenerative governance and the way how local people are involved in taking decisions about their local places.
Do you see an opportunity as well then, Julian?
Yeah, I think there's some amazing opportunities, and if you look at just some simple things about maybe rethinking how we look at some of our landscapes, or, you know, for example with trails, look at it as a corridor rather than looking at it as a thin line. And if you think it in those kind of ways, then you can think of it as a nature corridor, a people corridor, an access corridor, a biodiversity corridor, a landscape enhancement corridor. There's so many interesting things you can do with that.
What's your favourite corridor?
The coastal wild belt, which is basically the new opportunity we've got looking around the whole coast of England, which is taking the England coast path and the coastal margin there, and there's going to be a new kind of open access right along the English coast, which is an amazing opportunity. If we can also leverage that to improve wildlife and nature recovery in that really dynamic coastal space, I think it's going to be will be a global leader in that space.
Are you a coastal path kind of man, or are you more inland?
Definitely coastal. Love the coast. But in terms of my favourite corridor, and this goes back to lockdown experiences, I'd say it's the River Eden flowing through Carlisle. I live in the middle of Carlisle. We're lucky to have the River Eden flowing through the centre of town. But from that, I can then link into things like the Hadrian Wall National Trail.
If you could go back and say thank you to the people that legislated in 1949, what would be the one thing that you said, thank you for putting that in the Act?
I know the concept of natural beauty comes in for some criticism, but I think the concept of natural beauty, which was about thinking about all aspects of a place, the way people feel about it, react to it, is actually a really powerful concept. And the 49 Act gave us that concept.
Lovely stuff.
I'll choose access. So it gave us our national parks, but it gave us access to the countryside. So, and if you look kind of internationally at what other countries have done in that space, I think we've got quite a unique system, and it actually works despite its complexity.
I guess then the final questions really are, what is Natural England's role in this going forward? Because off the back of the Act, we saw essentially the creation of Natural England. What's the next step?
I think it's really important that we champion the whole idea of place, and again how all those different aspects of place come together and create the sort of identity that people associate with, and create the habitats, the ecological niches that species need to survive. So I think that's a really important aspect. The other, I'd say, I think we need to champion change. See things like national parks and national landscapes being living, changing landscapes, which will change and need to change for the future.
And I guess leading on from that, the final question, and you've both talked about people, how important they are, giving them access. If you were going to try and inspire those working in this sector, so maybe at Natural England, you know, in 25, 50, 75 years, what sort of piece of advice would you give them, or what piece of inspiration would you leave them with, do you think?
To be a champion and to really try and enhance what we've got, and to then use that as exemplars and beacons of sustainability going forward.
Lovely.
And I think it's the ability to make a difference, whether that's somebody who is working in an area team doing project delivery or advising on things like agri-environment schemes, or someone in one of the teams that's advising government on things like new legislation. You have a real ability to make a difference.
Brilliant stuff. Well, look, thank you both very much indeed. I don't like to think about where I'll be in 2099, but my little girl will be knocking around, and, you know, hopefully there will still be beautiful places for her to enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Saskia Luqmani works for the Protected Landscapes Partnership as a Senior Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Saskia, it's brilliant to have you on the pod. Welcome along.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, could you explain to me what the Protected Landscape Partnership is, please?
Absolutely, I can. So the Protected Landscapes Partnership is between the National Landscapes Association, National Parks England, National Trails UK and Natural England. And we've kind of come together in response to the Landscapes Review from 2019, really to work on kind of our shared goals around nature recovery and equity, diversity and inclusion.
And tell me a little bit about how the partners are working together to deliver what the Act set out, when it comes particularly to equity, diversion and inclusion.
So we have a sort of EDI work stream, which is split up into two different ways. So we have partner-led project for National Trails UK. They're working on a project called Language of Access and delivering workshops on inclusive landscapes. The National Parks are delivering a project called Co-Create a Vision of Belonging for National Park. And the National Landscapes Association are doing a piece of work called Nature Calling, which is working with kind of artists in the landscape. But also some of the work we are doing is around how we better share resources and how we better collaborate between each other, including with Natural England as well.
We often talk about connecting people to nature, but sometimes connecting these organisations to each other can be quite difficult, and people sort of can work, and there's brilliant things happening and you want to link that up. Have you had any feedback from the ground, as it were? Like, what are you seeing in response to this?
So I think that it's still quite early days, and I think that we're still doing a lot of working out the mechanisms of how to do that. But I know that there's a real want to make this work. There's a real want for people to be able to give quite a lot of the work that they've already done, but also that recognition that it doesn't work if we do this in isolation. And a lot of the things that we're trying to tackle, making landscapes more inclusive, has to happen everywhere. It can't happen in isolation. So I think there's a real will from people to want to do this better together. And there are some cases where those partnerships and those collaborations have already happened and they're going really well. But it's around how can we make those easier for people and let people know kind of what else is going on.
I'm fascinated what you've talked about in terms of art when it comes to diversity and inclusion, because I often think we need to find different ways to get people outside and into the landscapes. And yes, you might be interested in, you might be really outdoorsy and that's what you're into, but actually, if you've got a piece of art, people that maybe aren't really outdoorsy but are interested in art will be coming to these places. Is that sort of one of the aims of doing different things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if we really want to make these landscapes for everyone, that means that they've got to include lots of different ways of engagement. And we're not expecting everyone to be outdoorsy. We don't want everyone to go on a 10-mile hike every single time. I certainly don't want to do that. It's really great to see that there are so many different ways that we do engage with nature, and we can engage with nature. And also that's going to look different in different places, because it's going to meet the kind of, the unique points about all of our different landscapes. Everyone has something kind of different and unique to share and create. And I think it's really wonderful, and it brings, local groups together, but also from, a national point of view. These are our national landscapes, they're our national parks. They should be bringing, everyone to them as well. So I think having that diversity of experience is a matter of fact. It will happen. So we can do a lot of work around celebrating that.
You talk about it with such passion, which is so lovely to see. Your eyes sort of come alive. And I just wonder, what excites you about the possibilities within this work, and what are your hopes for the future of this?
I think one of the big challenges is really raising awareness and raising the profile of protected landscapes. I think that so a report came out by DEFRA recently that was looking at diversity of visitors to protected landscapes. It's a really helpful report because it looks specifically at protected landscapes, so that's really great for the work I'm doing. And one of the big barriers for people visiting and enjoying and caring about protected landscapes is that they don't know that they're there, and that they don't know that they're there for them. And it's our job to change that. And, I think that in this sector, there's lots of people who are so passionate about the work they're doing. They love working in protected landscapes. They love kind of working in this sector. And the most common story I hear is because, people have wonderful memories from when they were younger of being outdoors, connecting with nature, growing up in a protected landscape, which is really wonderful, but that is not the majority of people. And actually, if we're able to address some of those issues of having greater awareness of protected landscapes, yes, it really helps with increasing our visitors and having better connections, but along the line it can also help us with making sure we have better recruitment, because it means if more people know about them, they might care about them more and might want to work here.
Would you say that you have a favourite protected landscape? And if you do, is that something from your childhood, or is it something that you come to a little bit later maybe?
It was only in my very late teens and early 20s that I had a relationship with nature at all, and the way I found out about protected landscapes. So it was not something that, was part of my education, it was not part of my childhood experiences. I don't think I can answer the question of if I have a favourite place, because I obviously like them all. I did have a really lovely holiday recently in Malham, in the Yorkshire Dales National Park, which I have a very, very soft spot for Yorkshire generally. All of them are wonderful, and my professional opinion is they're all great.
Very well done indeed, and that is a beautiful place. Thank you so much for talking to me. I think we've got exactly the right person doing this job.
Thank you.
Chief Executive of Natural England, Marian Spain, is back on this pod. Marian, these landscapes, they can't stand still, can they? And the aim is to conserve, but it's also about looking for a sustainable future. There's been really big political change over the summer with announcements on planning and green energy as well. What do you think this means for people, landscapes and nature going forward?
I was in I think it was the Yorkshire Dales a few years ago, and they'd been very serious flooding. And I found myself saying to the people I was with, turning back and looking up on the hills and saying, well, the answer is we're going to have more trees up there, as one of the ways of managing the flow of water coming off these landscapes. So I think we might see that some of our national parks will perhaps become more wooded, partly because of climate change mitigation and soaking up carbon, but also, to sort of mitigate flood risk. So we may see more wooded national parks. Some of the landscapes that we've seen managed through certain agricultural practices that we've grown up with. People like me in the 80s and 90s got used to seeing very close cropped chalk downland in places like the South Downs. And we may need to think that both for climate reasons and for soil health reasons and for the welfare of the animals that graze the downs, that we might be seeing a more scrubby mosaic landscape with more trees to give shade to the animals and so on. So that the nature of the landscapes, I think, will evolve. But I think the biggest challenge that I think we really do need to start talking about seriously now is what is the right type of economic growth in a national park that supports nature as well. So what sort of small businesses do we need in our national parks, and what type of buildings and equipment and so on will they need? And I have been asking, and it was a rhetorical question, but it's coming a little less rhetorical, what type of energy infrastructure could be acceptable in a national park and an AONB? It might not be a massive wind farm, but it might be that we will have to find ways of having some renewable energy that provides for the needs of the people that need to live and work in those parks. But we've also now got a real opportunity to do more and to do differently. So we have the Environmental Improvement Plan, which our government is refreshing and reviewing. We're likely to have under this government, we're hearing ministers talk about nature and growth going hand in hand. We're hearing our ministers talk more and more about the need for people to connect with nature for their health and well-being. So this feels like a real tipping point. It's one of those moments when you can see a big change coming to really use that 75 years of legacy and make new things for the future.
Recognising the importance of everyone being able to access and enjoy naturally beautiful places was the reason that the 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act was created, and that is as important today as it was 75 years ago. In fact, in an increasingly volatile world, it could be even more vital in the decades to come. Natural England is connecting people with nature on a national scale, the effects of which cascade down to every level. 2024 is a real year for celebration, reflection, and also the opportunity to set out a vision for what could be achieved by 2099. What would that mean to you? My little girl would be 77 by then, and I hope that she's still as in love with the natural world as she is now, and that she has access to it. I'll see you next time on the Landscape Podcast.